tonight marks my first public speaking appearance since I was diagnosed with a tumor in my head a few months ago. And the good news is it's almost certainly benign, and it's also very small. And if the daily affirmations and meditations that I do don't stop it in its tracks, then it's supposed to grow very slowly. Some of the offshoots or symptoms from it include the aforementioned hearing problem that you sort of watched. I lost all hearing in my right ear, and that's permanent. So I have this strange feedback thing that goes on when noise goes above the normal conversation level. So that's one of the things I appreciate your patience with. When this happened in January, I also was completely incapacitated, so I had to teach myself how to walk again. And I think another key thing, well, maybe the most important thing that you may witness is that I've got an array of cognitive issues that sort of come and go, and so there's a good chance that I might stumble over more than a few words here or forget a line and have to look down at these notes. So I just ask for your patience with that as well. But sort of the flip side of all that is that when something like this happens to you, you often have a series of revelations. And that seems to have happened for me. Probably the most important one is that I have realized that trying to understand what compassion is really has been a journey for me. It's not a destination. And if I think back to my first job after college, I wanted to go into social work. And so my first job was as a person working in an adolescent residential treatment facility. There were kids who really had been dealt a pretty tough hand in life. So I came on the scene. I had my psychology degree. I felt like a pretty empathetic person, and so I thought I would do okay at the job. And for the first few weeks, seemed to be doing well. And then I remember as though it was yesterday. It was a Sunday night, and one of my clients, a 14-year-old girl, came just barging into the office. She had just been spending the weekend with her mother and her sister. And she came in, and there was just fire in her eyes. And I looked at her, and I could tell that the fire was just masking a lot of pain. And sure enough, within a few seconds, really, she started crying. And she was crying like I'd never seen anybody before. I don't think I've ever been since in the presence of anyone who was more inconsolable. And what she told me was that her mother, just as they were dropping her off, this is the other thing, this is a hot topic for me. Her mother told her that she was going to keep her 15-year-old sister, but she was disowning my client. So I spent the next 4 hours, really, all I could do was listen to her. I sat with her and I listened, and her emotions ranged pretty much between utter despair and grief to rage. And all I could think of doing was to try to convey to her, by listening, by staying with her, that I really cared about her, and that no matter what she did or said, that I wasn't going to leave. I was going to just be scared away. And I suppose mentioning that 2 years went by while we worked together. And when she left, she finally was taken into a foster home, a really nice family. The hug she gave me was pretty memorable. And I suppose, at that point, thinking back, I thought, all right, well, I guess I know what compassion means, and what it was then a pretty simple form. But a few years later, I discovered an entire area of compassion that I had never even thought about. I was still working as a social worker. I came home from work one day, and I had a newspaper, flipped it open, just trying to relax before dinner. And I flipped open to a page that had a picture of a tiny rhesus monkey. And he was sitting in what I can best describe as what looked like an electric chair. And he, actually, when I looked at him at first, I didn't notice that he had these two electrodes that were embedded into the top of his skull. And I didn't even realize that his hands and feet were shackled to this electric chair. The only thing that I saw when I looked at him was I saw the expression on his face and the look in his eyes. And what I saw looking back at me was hopelessness. And I hadn't really thought about what it was like to feel that much hopelessness since the story I started with, when I realized there was a very haunting similarity here. And what I decided to do is, I didn't even read the article. I ended up just intuitively feeling like I needed to know what this meant, but I didn't at the time. And so I cut the article out of the paper, and I was going to put it in a folder like this, and I figured I'd maybe get to read about animal experimentation and understand what was happening. And I walked over to my desk, had the picture, had the folder, and I put the paper into the folder. And then as I turned to walk away, I noticed just out of the corner of my eye that I hadn't put the paper neatly under the cover. And what I saw was I saw his face still seemingly looking back at me. And I stopped, and I looked, and I was going to straighten the picture out and cover it up, and I said to myself, if I cover this picture up, there's a really good chance I'm never going to look at it again. Because somehow I knew that very often in life, we come across information that's extremely upsetting to us. And we sometimes have a tendency to either literally or figuratively cover that information. So I left the picture exactly the way it was. And for the next few days, I had to walk past that picture. I had a pretty small apartment, and I had to walk past it at least twice a day. And every time, I watched, I looked, and my heart broke. But I left it that way, and I don't know how many more days passed, and I kept thinking about it. And one morning I remember waking up, and I felt something different. It was like some kind of shift had happened inside me, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. I walked over to my desk and I looked at the picture, and this time I felt not just that empathy for his suffering, but I also had this overwhelming desire to do something about it. And that moment is what led me to decide to become vegan and to dedicate part of my life to working for animal liberation. Again, that was an awakening that I didn't see coming, but I was very, very happy at that point to be able to feel like I could make choices in my life that I had been oblivious to for so many years. Different things to eat, different things to wear, donating money to science, but they didn't experiment on animals instead. All kind of choices like that. And for about the next 15 years, I kind of divided my time between working as a social worker and doing animal advocacy. And when I started doing animal advocacy, I ended up ending all my presentations with a Buddhist poem. And the poem it goes like this: all beings tremble before violence. All love life and all fear death. See yourself in others. Then who can you hurt? What harm can you do? The words, see yourself in others, were among the many that stood out to me. And I remember thinking, it's concise, it's profound, and I thought that it would be easy to implement, understand, teach about. And so again, I reached a point in my life where I thought, well, wow, I sort of learned the two sides of compassion, humans, animals. And so I proceeded thinking I kind of had a pretty good handle on things once again. And my life kind of turned upside down again with another experience that taught me something that, again, I hadn't really considered before. It was the first time I was living in near Washington, D.C. That's where I live now, but this was in the fall of 2002. And some of you may remember, but in October of that year, two men, referred to as the Beltway Snipers, began what can only be described as a 3-week reign of terror. It was the closest, maybe in my life, really, that I've ever been to a war zone. There were millions of people in the region, and over the course of those 3 weeks, 12 or 13 people were shot, 10 were killed. The first 6 fatalities occurred within a couple miles of where I lived, essentially my own neighborhood. One of them on the daily route that I would go walking down. In fact, now that I'm back in Maryland, anytime I drive or walk by that area, it kind of comes back. But during that stretch, everybody was so terrified. People were getting shot mowing the lawn, sitting at a bus stop. My gosh, going out to get the mail. So every moment you stepped out the door, or even sat next to a window, you wondered what would happen. So along the continuum of the crimes they committed, after one shooting towards the end of the sequence, I remember hearing it on the news and just sitting down, and I was just, like everybody else, I was desperate for the killings to end, but I also had been mourning all these deaths. And at that time, I started to think about what kind of psychological or emotional pain must these men be experiencing. I couldn't fathom where you would have to be in your own self to commit these kind of murders. I couldn't imagine how tortured your soul would have to be. And so, as I thought about that, I decided to do something that had occurred to me before. I decided before I go to bed to meditate. But I was going to meditate on behalf of the shooters. I couldn't think of anything else to do, and I thought if they could somehow find a way to someplace towards peace in their life, maybe this would come to an end. And far be it for me to say there's any connection, but 2 days later, the shootings ended, and they were apprehended. The fact that I have now reached a place where I thought, well, boy, I was aware of the fact that I lived, I don't know how many years I've been promoting and teaching compassion, and that night I started to think that maybe I had been guilty of something that I now refer to as selective compassion. I had never thought about extending that to people who had done the unthinkable. But I began to look at that in a different light. And so from that day on, I did work out, I continue to work a lot on issues like gun violence, which you all know about, people on both sides of that, genocide, another difficult concept to imagine, whether you're in the midst of it or imagine how people would reach a place where they would commit such a horror. And so probably for another 10 years or so, I was teaching about animal rights, about compassion and nonviolence, and then came December of last year. And I had just finished telling people who were close to me that I was the fittest I had ever been in my life. Actually, we didn't own a car then, so I was walking everywhere on top of the regular stuff I tried to do to work out. And I don't know, I guess I was just, I felt really good. And then a month later, I was on my way to the emergency room. And I didn't know if I was going to survive that night. Obviously I did. And, but the upshot was that another month would go by before I could do anything on my own. And I emphasize the word anything. I was completely incapacitated. It was as though, and I remember this distinctly because the first time, a couple weeks later with some help, I found myself standing at the sink looking in the mirror. When I looked up, I looked like I had aged 40 years. I was 100 years old. And during those weeks, I actually was grieving a number of things, but one of them felt like my own death. I did not know if I was going to be able to resume or reacquire any of the capabilities that I had before that day. But fortunately, with the help of loving friends and family, I started a self-rehabilitation program. And I started getting stronger physically. But the thing that really jumped out at me as I was going through that process was something that had nothing to do with the fact that my muscles were starting to come back in some way. And it all sort of crystallized when I tried to walk out my front door for the first time in a long time, under my own power. Open door, I shouldn't even say walk, because I could barely stand on my own. And I started staggering, which is the best I could do, down the sidewalk, down the street. And I was walking in almost like an S pattern. I was awkwardly lurching from side to side. I had no equilibrium. I guess that's evident by my description, but I should have mentioned it. I had zero equilibrium, and then I worked my way up to a little bit here. So I'm sort of staggering down the street, and I come to an intersection, and there's a woman who's in a motorized wheelchair, and she's waiting for the light to change. And I came upon her, and I knew we greeted each other. I could tell she wasn't able to communicate verbally, but we acknowledged each other. And I remember asking her if she was prepared for the light rain that is falling at that moment. She smiled and nodded. And as she was getting ready to cross the street, I guess the light changed. And as I was watching her, I started to think about friends of mine, family members, former clients of mine, all of who had had really, really difficult emotional or physical challenges over the course of their life. And I started to think that for most of my life, I had believed that I really understood what it was like for them to have those challenges. And I wondered that I was feeling something very new here. I thought about the fact that I had kind of been a caregiver professionally for all these years. And as my friends would say, I had grown into living this kind of freakishly healthy lifestyle. So I had to admit to myself, I was pretty humbled, but I realized that I had been doing all this work on behalf of others. I had created this sort of distance between myself and everybody else. But in this moment, the moment that I'm standing next to, a woman that I just met, I don't know, I probably won't see again, that distance started to melt away. And it occurred to me that even though she and I had taken these different paths in life, I felt what I would describe as a kinship of vulnerability and resilience. And it wasn't just her that I felt this way or connection to. Flashing through my mind were images of some very special people in my life. One of them is the founder of RADS, Stan Sapone, who I got to know 15 years ago and became a very important person in my life. And the courage that he showed in the final years of his life, when his body was deteriorating right before his eyes, was something that I started to think about. I thought about my Aunt Dorothy, who in her final weeks had been amazingly dignified while she was dying, and how she maintained that dignity even though she would talk to me about how afraid she was of her own death. I thought about my cousin Jay's wife and family, young couple, they were so strong, and she died in a tragic and very premature death, tragic accident. And all of these folks went flashing through my mind, and it stayed with me. I got home, and as the weeks went by, I started thinking about the fact that, it looked like every time I walked out of the house, because I was, my wonderful partner Deborah was always there for me, but when I walked out of the house, anytime I saw someone, it didn't matter who they were. Most of the time I didn't know who they were. I was looking at them through this lens, this new lens of what I call a kinship of vulnerability and resistance, of resilience. And it was interesting to me because most often, and I'm probably a good example here, I couldn't see what struggles they had, whether they were emotional or even physical. That was invisible to me, but I was now starting to realize how similar we really all are. And that is an awakening that sounds like it should be obvious, but for me, it's caused me to look at anything, at everyone, no matter whether I know them, even people who I know, and I still don't really know what really happens in your day-to-day life. Sometimes the person sitting next to you, or even in your family, you might not understand that. But I do know that we all struggle. We all have to find ways to deal with the things that come to us in life. And this has been a gift for me. And even though I might not go so far as to say that I'm really glad to have these challenges that I'm now facing, I can tell you without hesitation that I am so grateful for this awareness that's come to me as a result of this experience. And I realize, I guess I'm the last one to realize sometimes, that I still know that I've got an awful lot to learn still about compassion. But every day, today is another example, I am faced with all kinds of opportunities to literally see myself in others.